quick, we're getting ready to talk about Japan. The map shows you really what's going on in the world between the time of 400 AD through 1500 AD or CE, whichever you prefer. The area we're going to be focused on right now is Japan. And you can see at this point, just from the map, that Japan has been influenced by other people. But before we get into that, let's take a look about the geography of Japan. Japan's made roughly up of, say, around 4,000 or so islands. It is isolated from the mainland, but it's close enough to be influenced by China. The geography of Japan has, like I said, advantages and disadvantages. Southern Japan has a nice mild climate with plenty of rainfall. But like Greece, the country is so mountainous that about only 12% of the land is suitable for farming. Because it's an island that's short on natural resources like coal, iron, and oil. During the summer months and early fall, they have strong tropical storms. And these tropical storms, what we would call hurricanes, they call typhoons. And there's also the constant threat of earthquake and tidal waves in Japan. But its location where it's currently located, and if you take a look at its location, it does share a lot of advantages of isolation. It is hard to get to, and it is separated from the mainland. Therefore, it was able to develop a unique and really sophisticated culture. Japanese had a very strong culture. During the 1400s, the Japanese began to have more and more contact with Asia. But still, it had an extremely strong culture that remained resilient. The traditional religion in Japan is something called Shintoism, Shinto. It's a polytheistic religion based on the respect of nature and ancestor worship. The ancestor worship is probably the influence of China. They believed in the divine spirit called Kami, K-A-M-I, that live in nature. Sometimes they would see different objects in nature. If it's like a especially pretty tree or rock or something, they would think it was a spirit, and they would make a shrine out of it. But gradually, influence did come around, and Buddhism made an appearance in in Japan from China. Initially, Buddhism was accepted by Japanese emperors, but not necessarily Japanese society itself. The culture is so strong, sort of like when we take a look at Egypt, that it really couldn't overcome the native culture. And what you see happening is Buddhism sort of combining with Shintoism to make something called Zen Buddhism. And this Zen Buddhism was never the main religion in China, but it was a significant factor in Japanese culture. And so Zen Buddhism was a blend in Japan of both the traditional Shintoism and the Buddhism that came from China. And the Japanese sort of took this religion and made it their own. The classical period in Japan occurred roughly from, say, 794 to 1185, and it's called the Heian period, Heian, the Heian period. And this was when the imperial government of Japan was super strong, and Japan really experienced an unprecedented area of peace and prosperity. It's often referred to as the Golden Age of Japan, in that it was a time when literature sprang up. It's a time when art was at its best. It was a time when everything was really good. They were giving each other high fives as they walked down the streets of Japan. I mean, it was a good time to be Japanese. And the best account of Heian society, H-E-N society, comes from diaries, essays, and novels that were actually written by the women of the court. And some of the finest writers of Japan were actually women. And so that is an interesting note when compared to more Western civilization or even China. You don't really see that much on women writing or women taking part of any kind of academic endeavors. But in Japan, we see a little bit of glimpse where women did take part in their cultural development, and it was recognized. Oh yeah, and during this time period, I'd like to point out too that it's kind of funny to note that etiquette was extremely important during this classical period of Japan. And one of the things that was frowned upon in public was laughing. So during the classical period in Japan, it was frowned upon to actually laugh in public, which I find kind of comical because I just don't see how me or many of us in my classroom would ever actually be able to make it through classical Japan without laughing. Like all the good things, the classical era of Japan eventually ended, and the imperial government, the central power of Japan, gradually became weaker. Japan became a lot more lawless and dangerous. Farmers were attacked, pirates ravaged the coast, and so you basically see this decline to central authority. What happens to replace this is something called the feudal system, which is a similar feudal system as to what we have seen in Europe. And but it's got different names and a different set of players, so to speak. What happened in Japan was that basically farmers traded land to warlords, and these warlords are called the daimyos, D-A-I-M-Y-O, and they were served up under them by local warriors, and these were called samurai. Now, under the feudal system in Japan, like most feudal systems, like the one in China, the one in Europe, the leader, the emperor or the king has little power. Most of the power would remain with a position called the shoguns. And the shoguns would maintain the power. Now, and would have the real power. Now, what you hear a lot of about Japanese feudalism, this thing called a samurai. And basically a samurai is a soldier who's well armored, sort of like the European knights, and they followed a code called Bushido, and Bushido means the way of the warrior. And a samurai was expected to show reckless courage, honor, fairness, and generosity toward those weaker than himself. And he was also believed to have an honorable death, was more important than living a longer life. And it was these samurai warriors who was really the equivalent of the European knights. Now, it was the samurais who were the soldiers, but it was the shoguns who really had the real power. The shoguns held the real power, and they basically ruled as military dictators. And the shoguns maintained their power in Japanese political structure well into the 1860s, and roughly up to 1867, when Admiral Perry trained his guns on Tokyo and invited him to sign a treaty. Feudalism was good up to about 1467, when there was a big civil war, and that period lasted roughly 30 to 40 years, and order was restored by basically three powerful daimyos. And these three leaders were the ones who got back out there and reunited Japan. The most brutal and famous of those leaders is Oda Nobunaga. Right in front of you there, you can see how it's spelled. He conquered the Japanese capital of Kyoto and brought most of the Japan back together. His lieutenant, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, That's actually how it's pronounced, guys. I'm reading out the pronunciation guide here. But did restore order like his predecessor did, but he did so predominantly through political alliances and marriage. The final of the three leaders came in and conquered the last bit of Japan around 1600. And so now Japan's once again restored, but under a new leadership that would last Japan for roughly 250 more years. Now it was during this period of time, right after this reunification have occurred, that European merchants and missionaries began to appear in Japan. Then this was around the mid 1500s. The primary culture of all was Portuguese, and the dynasty, the shogunate enjoyed trade with the Europeans and everything. They enjoyed the new technologies, particularly guns, military. They did the ideas, but what was happening was that Christianity was beginning to undermine, as it did in the Roman Empire, the traditional culture of the of Japanese society. And so what happened was the shogun ordered the execution of all Christian missionaries, and then it sent Japan into basically an era of isolationism, where it banned foreign trade with any outsiders. It closed off most contact with the outside world, sort of focused in on itself. It did allow limited trade out of one port, and these are predominantly with only Dutch ships. But Japan at this point shut itself down around 1650 and stayed shut down for roughly 200 and some years. And it kept the world at its bay, not keeping up with technology or advancements, and sort of retreating into itself. And that's where we're going to stop off, because what happens next is an American admiral named Dewey sails into Tokyo Bay and sort of puts an end to Japanese period of isolation and rapidly brings Japan back into the modern world.